Atlanta International Airport, March 15, 2019. A pregnant flight attendant's body was discovered in the nursery of a luxury apartment complex near the airport terminals. What started as a pilot's secret affair would spiral into a deadly obsession involving 2 pregnancies, 3 shattered lives, and 1 fatal confrontation. Let's turn back time to understand how a decorated commercial pilot's double life led to this tragic end. Dawn breaks over the Atlanta skyline as Flight 847 descends through cotton candy clouds. In the cockpit, Marcus Hayes's weathered hands rest confidently on the controls, his eyes scanning the instruments with practiced precision. At 42, every landing still feels like poetry, a delicate dance between machine and man, earth and sky. Runway in sight, he announces, voice steady. The first rays of sunlight catch his silver-flecked temples, illuminating a face that's seen countless sunrises from 35,000 feet. The aircraft responds to his touch like an old friend, settling onto the runway with barely a whisper. Through the terminal windows, the early morning bustle plays out like a choreographed routine. Baggage handlers move in synchronized patterns, fuel trucks circle like patient predators, and fresh crews stride purposefully toward their gates. At the arrival area, Isabella Parker stands slightly apart from the crowd, her senior flight attendant uniform crisp despite the early hour. At 35, she carries herself with the kind of quiet confidence that turns heads without trying. Their eyes meet across the terminal, a subtle exchange that speaks of shared secrets and comfortable familiarity. 3 years of love built in stolen moments between flights, in shared apartments with views of landing lights, in the understanding that comes from living life above the clouds. 3 years earlier, the flight training center buzzes with nervous energy. New recruits clutch manuals like lifelines while veteran crew members breeze through security. Marcus, then fresh from divorce and buried in his work, notices her immediately. The new flight attendant trainer who carries herself like she owns the sky. Safety demonstrations are more than motions, Isabella tells her class, demonstrating with graceful precision. They're a promise to your passengers. Her eyes meet Marcus's as he passes, and something electric passes between them. Their first conversation happens over spilled coffee in the break room. Her laugh fills the space, genuine and warm. A pilot who apologizes, she teases. Now that's a rare species. Days become weeks, professional nods become lingering glances, and eventually, casual conversations transform into late-night discussions about life at cruising altitude. Their love grows like a slow sunrise, gradual, inevitable, illuminating. Their apartment near the airport tells their story, his captain's stripes hanging beside her senior crew wings, photographs of shared layovers in distant cities, 2 lives intertwined by sky and circumstance. They've mastered the delicate balance of professional distance at work. Crew members know, of course, nothing stays secret at an airline, but respect the boundaries they've drawn. Then comes the morning that changes everything. The pre-flight briefing room hums with the usual energy, coffee-fueled conversations, weather reports being studied, flight plans discussed. Marcus reviews his notes while Isabella efficiently organizes the cabin crew assignments. The door opens, and conversation stalls like an engine missing a beat. Victoria Rose enters as if she's walking a runway instead of joining one. 28, with amber eyes that seem to take in everything at once, she introduces herself as a transfer from European operations. Her smile is practiced, perfect, but there's something calculating in the way she surveys the room, lingering just a fraction too long on Marcus before turning her full attention to Isabella. Senior Attendant Parker, Victoria's voice carries a hint of silk over steel. I've heard so much about your leadership program. I'm hoping to learn everything you can teach. Isabella, ever professional, welcomes her warmly, beginning to outline the route patterns and crew expectations. But Marcus notices something else. The way Victoria's attention seems to drift between them, assessing, measuring. Her questions are perfectly crafted to highlight her experience while subtly emphasizing her youth and enthusiasm. Through the following weeks, Victoria proves herself exceptional at her job. Perhaps too exceptional. She anticipates needs before they're expressed, positions herself at optimal moments, her presence always somehow intersecting with Marcus's path. Her laughter carries down the aisles at just the right volume, her gestures graceful and measured, each interaction a carefully choreographed dance. Isabella notices only the perfect professional, a promising protégé eager to learn. But Marcus recognizes something familiar in Victoria's eyes, the same hunger for more that once drove him through the ranks. Only now, watching her calculated movements through the cabin, he wonders if that hunger might consume them all. They say the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves, Marcus's earlier words echo. But sometimes, the most dangerous truth is the one we're not ready to see. Victoria had perfected the art of orchestrated coincidence. Each morning, she studied the crew schedules with the precision of a military strategist, memorizing Marcus's patterns, his preferences, his routines. During pre-flight checks, she'd materialize in the cockpit doorway, 2 coffees in hand, one black with a hint of cinnamon for herself, the other precisely how Marcus preferred it, though he'd never told her directly. "Just how you like it, Captain," she'd say, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to linger in the confined space. Her fingers would brush against his during the exchange, a touch so subtle it could be dismissed as accidental, yet deliberate enough to send electricity through his skin. The scent of her perfume, something exotic with notes of jasmine and vanilla, would remain long after she left, a ghost of her presence haunting the cockpit. In crew meetings, Victoria demonstrated remarkable skill in positioning herself. Never directly across from Marcus, that would be too obvious, but always within his peripheral vision, where every subtle movement would catch his attention. Her responses to his briefings were masterfully crafted, professional enough to be beyond reproach, yet laden with undertones that only he seemed to notice. The way she'd tilt her head while listening, how her eyes would hold his for a fraction too long, the slight curve of her lips when he spoke, all carefully choreographed to appear natural while being anything but. The late-night layovers in Dubai became increasingly dangerous territory. Isabella's promotion to senior crew coordinator meant longer hours managing next day's logistics, leaving Marcus alone with thoughts he knew he shouldn't entertain. Victoria would find him in the hotel's whiskey lounge, its leather chairs and dim lighting creating an intimacy that felt removed from their everyday reality. Their conversations began safely enough, discussing weather patterns over the Atlantic, sharing stories about difficult passengers, debating the merits of different aircraft models. But as the nights wore on and the premium whiskey worked its magic, the protective walls of professionalism began to crumble. "My father wasn't just a pilot," Victoria shared one evening, her voice taking on a vulnerable quality that made Marcus lean closer. "He was an artist in the sky. The way he talked about flying, it wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was about freedom, about touching the face of God." She traced the rim of her glass, eyes distant with carefully crafted memory. "He always said the sky was the only place he felt truly alive. That everything else was just existing." She leaned forward, her perfume mingling with the aged whiskey between them. "I see that same look in your eyes sometimes, Marcus. When you're in the cockpit, when you're free from everything down here. That hunger for something more than routine, more than the predictable patterns we're all supposed to want." Her words struck a chord Marcus hadn't realized was so perfectly tuned to his own doubts. In the amber light of the lounge, he found himself sharing thoughts that had only existed in the darkest corners of his mind. About how the stability he'd built with Isabella, beautiful as it was, sometimes felt like a gilded cage. How the predictability of their life together, once comforting, now seemed to suffocate him in moments of weakness. Victoria listened with an intensity that made him feel truly seen. Not as Captain Hayes, the reliable pilot with a perfect record. Not as Isabella's partner, the man who had built a comfortable life. But as Marcus, the man who still yearned for something more, something dangerous and undefined. The pivotal moment arrived during a seemingly routine flight to Singapore. The weather report had mentioned minor turbulence, but what hit them was anything but minor. The Boeing 787 bucked and shuddered, drinks spilling in the cabin as passengers gasped and prayed. In the chaos, Victoria appeared in the cockpit, against protocol. They both knew, steadying herself against Marcus's seat as he fought to maintain control. Her hand gripped his shoulder, fingers pressing into his uniform. The aircraft dipped violently, and her other hand braced against the back of his neck. For a crucial moment, As Marcus navigated through the storm, the electricity between them was more powerful than the lightning flashing outside. Her breath was warm against his ear, her presence both a distraction and an anchor. Later that night, in the suffocating humidity of Singapore, they found themselves in the hotel's rooftop garden. The city spread out below them like a carpet of stars, mirroring the sky above. The air felt thick with more than just moisture. It was heavy with unspoken possibilities, with choices hovering on the edge of being made. "We shouldn't be here," Marcus whispered, but his body betrayed him, turning toward her like a compass finding north. Victoria moved closer, eliminating the safe distance between them. "Shouldn't doesn't mean don't want to," she murmured, her fingers finding his jaw, tracing the tension there. "I've watched you, Marcus. I've seen how you look at me when you think no one's watching. How long are you going to deny yourself what you really want?" The first kiss was inevitable, like gravity. It felt like the first time he'd broken through cloud cover into clear sky. Terrifying and liberating, dangerous and perfect. In Victoria's arms, Marcus rediscovered parts of himself he thought had died. The risk-taker, the man who wasn't bound by schedules and expectations. The guilt would come later, in the grey hours before dawn, but Victoria knew exactly how to soothe it away. "Life is too short for regrets," she whispered against his skin as the Singapore sunrise painted the room in shades of gold. "We're not hurting anyone. This is just for us, just our secret." Back home, Marcus began the delicate dance of a double life. Isabella's presence, once his foundation, now felt like a reminder of his betrayal. She spoke of their future with such certainty, house hunting in quiet neighborhoods away from the airport's constant rhythm, casual mentions of starting a family. Meanwhile, Victoria's messages burned in his secret phone, hidden in his flight bag. "Last night was perfect. I can still taste your kisses. When can I see you again?" The close calls accumulated like near misses in flight. A lipstick smudge on his collar that he caught just before a debriefing. A text preview that flashed across his screen while Isabella was reaching for his phone to take a photo. A chance encounter in a hotel lobby that required quick thinking and quicker lies. Each near discovery should have been a warning, but instead, the danger became part of the addiction. Marcus developed systems worthy of a spy novel. Separate email accounts accessed only through private browsers. Calendar entries coded to look like routine flight preparations. Extra shifts, carefully planned around Isabella's schedule. He told himself it was temporary, that he just needed time to figure things out, to find his way back to solid ground. But Victoria's hold on him grew stronger with each clandestine meeting, each stolen moment in foreign cities. "I've never felt this way about anyone," she'd tell him, her body intertwined with his in anonymous hotel rooms. "No one understands me like you do, Marcus. No one else sees me the way you do." Her words echoed his own unspoken feelings, making the deception seem almost noble, almost justified. Isabella, ever perceptive, noticed the subtle changes. His mood swings, the way his attention would drift during their conversations, his new habit of checking his phone when he thought she wasn't looking, the restlessness in his sleep, the way he'd sometimes wake up reaching for something, or someone, that wasn't there. But her trust in him was absolute, and she attributed it all to work stress, to the pressure of new routes and increased responsibilities. "You seem distant lately," she said one evening, reaching for his hand across their dinner table. The concern in her eyes was like a knife in his gut. "Is everything okay? You can talk to me, you know?" "Just tired," he replied, the lie flowing with practiced ease. "These new routes are demanding. I just need to adjust." The words tasted bitter, but he'd grown accustomed to the flavor of deception. That night, as Isabella slept peacefully beside him, her trust in him a silent accusation, Marcus's phone lit up with Victoria's message, "I need you. Tomorrow." No excuses. His heart raced as he read it, already planning how to rearrange his schedule, knowing he should refuse but knowing he wouldn't. The next morning, he called in favors to switch his flight assignment, telling himself it would be the last time, knowing it was a lie. Deep down, as he watched Isabella leave for her own flight, Marcus recognized that he was spiraling into something he couldn't control. The most terrifying part wasn't the lies, the deceits, or even the risk of discovery. The most terrifying part was that, despite everything, despite the guilt and shame and fear, he wasn't sure he wanted to stop. The morning light filtered through the bathroom blinds, casting striped shadows across the collection of pregnancy tests arranged on the marble counter. Isabella stared at them, her hands trembling as she lined them up for the 5th time. First response, clear blue, store brand, digital readout, all displaying the same undeniable truth. 3 years of building a life with Marcus, and now this unexpected miracle was about to change everything. She touched her stomach, still flat beneath her silk robe, trying to imagine the life growing inside her. The wave of morning sickness that had sent her running to the pharmacy 3 days ago now felt like a blessing. A prayer answered. A future taking shape. In the kitchen, she could hear Marcus going through his pre-flight routine. The familiar sound of coffee brewing, the rustle of his flight charts, the quiet murmur of weather reports playing on his tablet. Such ordinary moments, about to be transformed forever. "I need to show you something," she called out, her voice wavering between terror and elation. She found him by the coffee maker, his captain's uniform pristine, his silver-flecked hair neatly combed. The moment felt surreal, like standing at the edge of a cliff, about to step into thin air. When Marcus saw the tests arranged in her trembling hands, his coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. She watched emotions flash across his face like weather systems. Shock, fear, joy, and something else, something that looked almost like guilt. There and gone so quickly she thought she might have imagined it. "We're going to be parents." The coffee cup clattered against the counter as he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with desperate intensity. She breathed in his familiar scent, starched uniform, cologne, coffee, feeling his heart racing against her cheek. His voice cracked with emotion. "A baby? Our baby?" The happiness that followed felt pure, untainted by the complexities that would soon shatter their world. They spent the evening in a bubble of joy, planning and dreaming. Isabella curled up on their sofa, notebook in hand, making lists of everything they'd need. The spare room would become a nursery, she could already picture it. Walls painted in soft yellows and greens, a rocking chair by the window overlooking the airport's distant lights. "We could put the crib here," she said, sketching layouts on her pad. "And maybe a little bookshelf along this wall. Our baby needs to grow up surrounded by stories." Her hands kept drifting to her stomach, protective, wondering. Marcus watched her with an intensity that made her heart swell, his own hand joining hers over their unborn child. That night, as Isabella slept peacefully beside him, Marcus lay awake, making silent promises to their baby, to Isabella, to himself. He would end things with Victoria. This was his chance at redemption, at being the man Isabella believed him to be. The man his child deserved as a father. But Victoria had already set her own plans in motion, plans that would turn their joy to ashes. During their next layover in Bangkok, Marcus tried to end it cleanly. He chose neutral ground, the hotel's business center, all glass walls and professional distance. But Victoria's calm reaction should have warned him that something was wrong. "That's wonderful news about Isabella," she said, her voice carrying an edge like frozen steel. "I have some news too." The pregnancy test she placed on the desk between them might as well have been a loaded gun. Marcus stared at it, his world tilting on its axis. That's impossible," he stammered, but even as the words left his mouth, he was doing the math, remembering nights in Singapore, in Dubai, in countless other cities where passion had overwhelmed caution. Victoria's smile was a predator's grin. 2 weeks behind Isabella, according to my doctor. She watched his face crumble with clinical interest. "So what are we going to do about this, Marcus? About our baby?" The days that followed became a nightmare of juggling two increasingly demanding situations. Victoria's messages grew more frequent, more threatening. "I won't be your dirty little secret," she texted at 3 a.m. "My baby deserves better than that. Our baby deserves a father who acknowledges them." Meanwhile, Isabella's pregnancy proved difficult from the start. Severe morning sickness left her pale and weak, forcing her to take medical leave from flying. Marcus found himself splitting his time between holding her hair back during bouts of nausea and fielding Victoria's escalating demands. The strain began showing in every aspect of his life. In the cockpit, his co-pilots noticed his distraction, the way his hands sometimes trembled during instrument checks. "Everything okay, Captain?" they'd ask, concern mixing with professional worry. Flight attendants whispered about his frequent phone checks, his haunted expression during layovers. Victoria, ever calculating, began a campaign of psychological warfare. She'd appear like a ghost in places she knew Isabella would be: their local coffee shop, the medical center during Isabella's prenatal appointments, even the grocery store where they did their weekly shopping. Each time, she maintained just enough distance to avoid a direct confrontation while ensuring her presence was felt. "Your girlfriend looks tired," she'd text afterward. "First trimester's rough, isn't it? I'm doing much better with our little one. Must be stronger genes." Each message was a twist of the knife, a reminder of the impossible situation he'd created. The pressure built like altitude sickness, a slow, inexorable compression that made it harder and harder to breathe. Isabella, her intuition heightened by pregnancy hormones, began noticing things she'd overlooked before. The way Marcus startled at unexpected sounds, how he guarded his phone like it contained state secrets, the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. The facade finally cracked when Isabella found the receipt while doing laundry, a small slip of paper from a high-end jewelry store in Singapore, dated during what was supposed to be an extra training shift. The look on her face as she held it up made Marcus's blood run cold. "What's this?" Her voice was tight with suppressed emotion. Marcus fumbled for explanations, each lie tripping over the next, becoming more tangled, more desperate. The silence that followed his stammered excuses felt like the moment before a crash. Then Isabella's phone chimed, a sound that would forever mark the moment their world shattered. The message from the unknown number was brutally simple: "Ask him about Victoria." What followed was a catastrophe in slow motion. Isabella's questions came like body blows, each one stripping away another layer of deception. Marcus watched helplessly as understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by a horror that cut him deeper than any anger could. "How long?" The question was barely a whisper, her hand instinctively covering her belly, protecting their child from the truth. "Isabella, please." He reached for her, but she recoiled as if his touch might burn. "How long?" The scream held all the pain he'd been inflicting for months. His confession emerged in broken pieces, each admission driving the knife deeper. But he couldn't bring himself to reveal Victoria's pregnancy. Not yet. Not while Isabella was still struggling with her own delicate condition. One devastating truth at a time seemed like the only mercy he could offer. "Get out." Isabella's voice was raw, stripped of everything but pain. "I can't even look at you right now." The words fell like a final judgment. Marcus stumbled out of their apartment into the gathering darkness, his phone already vibrating with messages from Victoria. She was waiting at their usual hotel, ready to comfort him, to dig her claws in deeper now that his life was unraveling. But as he drove through the night, the reality of his situation finally hit him with full force. He was watching both his worlds collide in slow motion, powerless to stop the impending disaster. 2 pregnancies, 2 women, 2 versions of himself, all accelerating toward a reckoning he couldn't escape. The weight of it crushed his chest, made it hard to breathe. In a different hotel, as far from both women as he could manage, Marcus confronted his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The man staring back was a stranger, haunted eyes, day-old stubble, the look of someone trapped in a nightmare of his own making. His phone kept lighting up on the counter, Isabella's messages full of raw hurt and anger, Victoria's alternating between sympathy and subtle threats. In the quiet hours before dawn, as he sat in the darkness listening to the hum of the air conditioning, Marcus finally understood the true scope of the storm he had created. It would destroy everything in its path: careers, relationships, trust, futures, and at the center of it all were 2 innocent lives, 2 unborn children who would bear the weight of their father's choices. The next morning would bring confrontations he couldn't avoid, truths he couldn't hide, consequences he couldn't escape. But for now, in the artificial peace of his hotel room, Marcus Hayes, pilot, lover, liar, father-to-be, sat alone with his guilt, wondering how he would protect two innocent children from the chaos their father had unleashed. The answer, he feared, was that he couldn't. Some storms can only be weathered, never outrun. The pregnancy wing of Atlanta General Hospital buzzed with typical morning activity as Isabella waited for her 20-week checkup. Her hand absently rubbed her growing belly as she scrolled through Marcus's phone records, a habit she developed since discovering his betrayal. That's when she saw it. Another appointment, same hospital, same department, 30 minutes after hers. Victoria had gotten sloppy, or perhaps she wanted to be discovered. She walked past Isabella's examination room twice, her own pregnant belly now impossible to hide. Their eyes met through the door's window, and Victoria's smile held no warmth, only triumph. Isabella's doctor noticed her elevated blood pressure. Stress isn't good for the baby, she warned. If only she knew. Meanwhile, Marcus's attempts to keep his worlds separate were crumbling. Victoria's behavior became increasingly erratic. She appeared everywhere, outside his apartment, at crew briefings she wasn't assigned to, even at his regular coffee shop. Her messages grew more demanding, more threatening. "Your baby deserves to know its sibling," she wrote. "How long do you think you can keep us apart?" The airline couldn't ignore the tension anymore. Crew members whispered about the strange dynamic between their captain and the two pregnant flight attendants. Marcus's pristine record began accumulating notes, delayed pre-flight checks, distraction during briefings, excessive phone use during layovers. Captain Hayes, his supervisor, called him in one morning. "There are concerns about your recent performance. Perhaps you need some time off." But time off meant less control, and Marcus couldn't risk that. Not with Victoria's increasing instability. She'd started contacting Isabella directly, sending cryptic messages about Marcus's whereabouts, about their shared situation. The confrontation at their apartment was inevitable. Isabella had finally pieced everything together: the parallel prenatal appointments, the matching timeline, the identical gestational updates. She waited until Marcus came home, her packed suitcase by the door. "Were you ever going to tell me?" Her voice was eerily calm. "About your baby with her?" Marcus froze, his uniform suddenly suffocating. "Isabella, please don't." Her scream shattered the calm. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. You got us both pregnant. You bastard. You're having two babies, with two different women, weeks apart." The truth hung between them like poison gas. Then, as if summoned by the chaos, Victoria appeared at their door. She'd been waiting, listening, choosing her moment. "He doesn't love either of us," Victoria announced, stepping into their home uninvited. "He loves the power, the thrill of having two women, two babies, two lives." Isabella's protective instincts flared. "Get out of my house." "Your house?" Victoria laughed, one hand on her belly. "Honey, nothing in your life is just yours anymore. Not your home, not your man, not even your baby's father." Marcus stepped between them, but it was too late. The confrontation spilled into the hallway, their private drama becoming public spectacle. Neighbors peered through doors as accusations flew. Victoria revealed every detail of their affair, each word calculated to cause maximum damage. The next day, the scene repeated at the airport. Victoria deliberately booked herself on Isabella's flight, forcing a public confrontation at the gate. Crew members watched in horror as their personal lives exploded in full view of passengers and staff. "This is what betrayal looks like," Victoria announced loudly. "Your respected Captain Hayes, father of two babies by two women. What kind of example is that for the airline?" Security had to escort all three of them out. Marcus's suspension was immediate, pending investigation. Isabella's medical leave became permanent. Victoria's smug satisfaction lasted until she too was grounded for unprofessional conduct. But losing their jobs only intensified the situation. Victoria, untethered from professional constraints, began stalking them openly. She followed Isabella to doctor's appointments, took photos of her shopping for baby supplies, sent Marcus hourly updates about both pregnancies. "Your babies will know each other," she texted Marcus. "Whether you want it or not. We're family now." Isabella's protective instincts went into overdrive. She installed security cameras, changed her routines, kept a detailed log of Victoria's harassment. But nothing could prepare her for finding Victoria in their building's laundry room, handling her washing. "Just checking the baby clothes," Victoria said sweetly. "Making sure they're clean enough for our children." The encounter turned physical. Isabella, despite her pregnancy, pushed Victoria away from her laundry. Victoria's calm facade cracked, revealing something dark and dangerous underneath. "Touch me again," she hissed, "and I'll make sure your baby grows up without a mother." Marcus arrived to find them squared off, both women protective of their unborn children, both pushed to their limits by his betrayal. He managed to separate them, but the damage was done. Victoria's threat hung in the air like a loaded gun. That night, as Marcus and Isabella sat in their darkened apartment, the weight of the situation crushed them. Security cameras showed Victoria's car still parked outside, waiting, watching. "She's not going to stop," Isabella whispered, hands protectively around her belly. "She's going to keep pushing until something breaks." Marcus stared at his phone, filled with Victoria's increasingly unhinged messages. "I'll fix this," he promised, but they both knew it was beyond fixing. In her own apartment, Victoria sat in the nursery she'd prepared, rocking slowly in a chair meant for late-night feedings. Photos of Marcus covered one wall, surveillance shots, stolen moments, evidence of their affair. Her hand traced patterns on her pregnant belly as she planned her next move. "Soon," she whispered to her unborn child. "Soon we'll be a real family. Whatever it takes." The stage was set for a final confrontation. 3 lives, 2 pregnancies, 1 impossible situation. Something had to break. And when it did, none of them would emerge unscathed. Rain pounded against the windows of Isabella's apartment as she noticed the familiar shadow in her security camera feed. Victoria had been following her all day, from her doctor's appointment to the grocery store, maintaining just enough distance to avoid a confrontation. Now, at 7 months pregnant, Isabella felt more vulnerable than ever. She was arranging baby clothes in the nursery when she heard it, the distinctive click of a key in the lock. Her blood ran cold. She'd changed the locks twice, but somehow Victoria had gotten a copy. The front door creaked open. "Beautiful nursery," Victoria's voice carried from the doorway. "But it's missing something. Pictures of the baby's sibling, perhaps." Isabella turned slowly, one hand instinctively protecting her belly. Victoria stood in the doorway, her own pregnancy prominent, her face a mask of calculated calm. In her hand, she held something that made Isabella's heart stop, a small album. "Found these in Marcus's old flight bag," Victoria said, flipping through photos of her own ultrasounds. "Thought we could compare. See which baby looks more like Daddy." "Get out." Isabella's voice shook with rage. "You're trespassing." Victoria's laugh held no humor. "Trespassing? Honey, I'm family now. Whether you like it or not, our children are siblings. They deserve to know each other." "Our children will never know each other," Isabella snapped. "You're delusional." Victoria's mask cracked. She lunged forward, grabbing Isabella's arm. "You don't get to decide that. You don't get to keep my baby from its family." The struggle was brief but violent. 2 pregnant women, both protecting their unborn children, both driven by months of pain and rage. Isabella broke free, but Victoria charged again, sending them both crashing into the nursery furniture. The rocking chair toppled, photo frames shattered. "Stop!" Isabella screamed. "Think about the babies." "I am thinking about them." Victoria's eyes were wild. "I'm thinking about how you're trying to destroy their chance at being a real family." In the chaos, Victoria's foot caught on a fallen blanket. She stumbled, reaching for the edge of the changing table. Isabella, acting on instinct, pushed her away. Victoria fell backward, her head striking the corner of the heavy wooden dresser with a sickening crack. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria lay motionless, blood pooling beneath her head. Isabella stood frozen, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. Marcus answered on the first ring. "She's here," Isabella whispered. "Oh God. Marcus, she's not moving." Marcus broke every traffic law getting there. He found Isabella in the corner of the nursery, hands pressed against her belly, tears streaming down her face. Victoria's body lay where she had fallen, the blood now a stark contrast against the pale nursery carpet. "I didn't mean to," Isabella kept whispering. She wouldn't stop. "I was protecting our baby." Marcus called 911, his pilot's training kicking in. He checked Victoria's pulse, finding nothing. The next hours passed in a blur of police lights and questions. Crime scene technicians photographed the nursery while detectives separated them for statements. "She had a key," Isabella explained repeatedly. "I don't know how she got it. She just appeared." The truth began emerging in layers. In Victoria's apartment, police found a shrine to her obsession, hundreds of photos of Marcus, detailed journals planning their future together, copies of Isabella's medical records, stolen mail. But the most chilling discovery was her laptop. She had a pattern, the detective explained grimly. 3 other airlines, 3 other pilots. All married or in relationships. She'd get close, create drama, then disappear with settlements or payoffs. But this time, the media descended like vultures. "Deadly love triangle 35,000 feet," screamed the headlines. Every detail of their private lives became public fodder. The airline suspended everyone involved pending investigation. Victoria's autopsy revealed more secrets. Previous pregnancies, previous identities, a history of mental health issues carefully hidden beneath her polished exterior. Her real name wasn't even Victoria. Isabella was cleared of charges, self-defense, protecting an unborn child. But the cost was devastating. Her perfect life had shattered, replaced by scandal and whispers. Marcus lost his pilot's license, their reputations in tatters. 2 months later, as Isabella lay in the delivery room, the weight of everything crashed over them. Their healthy baby girl would never escape the shadow of how she came into the world. Somewhere across town, Victoria's baby, a boy, was being placed in state custody, another innocent victim of his mother's obsession. The media eventually moved on, but the scars remained. In the quiet of their new home, far from the airport where it all began, Isabella would sometimes catch Marcus staring at their daughter, wondering about her half-brother, about the price of his betrayal, about the fine line between love and obsession that had led them all to this point. The truth had emerged, but some wounds never fully heal. They could only move forward, knowing their daughter would one day ask questions they weren't sure how to answer. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when the final ruling came down. Isabella, still recovering from childbirth, gripped Marcus's hand as their lawyer read the statement. Self-defense in protection of an unborn child. The charges were officially dropped, but the verdict brought little comfort. The airline's investigation was less forgiving. Marcus's commercial license was permanently revoked. 2 decades of flying, ended by 18 months of poor choices. Isabella resigned before they could terminate her, her perfect record now stained by scandal. Victoria's family emerged from the shadows during the investigation, revealing a history of similar incidents across 3 states. "We tried to get her help," her sister testified, tears streaming down her face. But she was so convincing, so good at hiding her true nature. The media coverage was relentless. Every morning brought new headlines. High-flying romance ends in tragedy. Pilot's double life leads to death. Their faces appeared on true crime shows, their story dissected by strangers who knew nothing of the real pain, the real consequences. In the midst of the chaos, 2 babies were born. Isabella's daughter, Emma, arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, perfect and innocent despite the storm that surrounded her birth. 2 weeks later, in state custody, Victoria's son drew his first breath. The boy, whom the state named Lucas, was immediately placed in foster care, his future uncertain. Recovery came in small steps. Marcus found work as a flight simulator instructor, teaching students while keeping his feet firmly on the ground. Isabella focused on motherhood, finding peace in the simple routines of caring for Emma. They moved to a smaller house in a different city, where neighbors didn't recognize their faces from the news. Their relationship required the most healing. Trust, once broken, proved harder to rebuild than their careers. They attended counseling, learning to talk about the trauma, the betrayal, the guilt that haunted them both. "I think about him," Isabella admitted one session, speaking of Lucas. "I wonder if he looks like Emma, if he'll inherit the same love of planes she has." Marcus carried a heavier burden. His son was growing up without him, a decision made by courts and social workers who deemed it best for the child's well-being. He sent birthday cards through official channels, knowing they'd be stored until Lucas was old enough to decide if he wanted to know his father's story. The community slowly accepted them back. Other parents at Emma's preschool stopped whispering when Isabella volunteered. Marcus's students, too young to remember the scandal, respected him for his knowledge rather than his notoriety. 5 years passed, marked by Emma's first steps, first words, first flight in a small private plane with her father at the controls of a simulator. She grew into a bright, curious child, unaware of the shadow her birth had cast. On Emma's 5th birthday, as she blew out her candles in their backyard surrounded by friends, Isabella watched Marcus watching their daughter. The pain was still there in his eyes, but it had softened with time. They had survived the worst of the storm. That night, after the party, they sat on their porch swing, Emma asleep upstairs clutching her new toy airplane. "I received a letter," Marcus said quietly. "Lucas's adoptive parents. They want to know if we'd consider letting the kids meet someday. When they're older. When they can understand." Isabella took his hand, feeling the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. "They deserve to know their story," she replied. "All of it. When they're ready." The porch light cast long shadows across their yard, where Emma's birthday decorations still fluttered in the evening breeze. Somewhere across the country, another 5-year-old boy was probably getting ready for bed, perhaps dreaming of flying, unaware of the complex web of love, betrayal, and redemption that had brought him into the world. Life had moved forward, as it always does. The scandal had faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher scandals. But for those involved, the impact remained, transformed by time into something different, not forgotten, but survivable. A reminder that even the darkest storms eventually clear, leaving behind both damage and growth, scars and healing, endings and new beginnings. Marcus and Isabella held each other in the growing darkness, listening to the distant sound of planes overhead, carrying other lives, other stories, toward their own destinations. They had learned the hardest way that love, like flight, requires not just passion but wisdom, not just desire but responsibility. Their journey hadn't ended that rainy night in a nursery. It had simply changed course, leading them toward a future they never expected but had learned to embrace, one day at a time.